Welcome back. Here with us on Urban Debate on Mirror Now. The war between Russia and Ukraine entered 43rd day today, with the United States announcing fresh sanctions that target Russia's biggest banks and President Vladimir Putin's daughters. US President Joe Biden again accused Putin of committing major war crimes and called for an investigation. Ukrainian President Zelensky, meanwhile, accused Russia of trying to hide the evidence of war crimes to interfere with the international investigation. The UN General Assembly, meanwhile, is voting on a draft resolution seeking to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. This was initiated by the US after harrowing images emerged of corpses strewn across streets of Ukrainian city Bucha. The UN General Assembly, by a two-thirds majority of the members present and voting, may suspend rights of membership in Council of a member commits gross violations of human rights. Abstentions are not taken into account during voting. It is also a test for India on its neutral stand, because since January, India has abstained on at least 11 occasions on procedural votes and draft resolutions in the UN Security Council, General Assembly and Human Rights Council condemning Russian aggression against Ukraine. Let's now go across to the experts joining us on the broadcast this evening to understand what will this vote really mean for Russia. Joining us on the broadcast this evening is Maruf Raza, Group Consulting Editor, Times Network; Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti, former Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs; Dilip Sinha, former Permanent Representative of India to the United Nations. Thank you very much, all of you gentlemen, for joining us here on Urban Debate on Mirror Now. Mr. Dilip Sinha, I want to begin the discussion with you. What will Russia's ouster from UN Human Rights Council really mean?
It would be a loss of face for Russia, because this will be only the second occasion in the 12-15-year history of the Human Rights Council that a country will be expelled. The last country was Libya in 2011, and thereafter no other country has actually been expelled. The US withdrew for about a couple of years under Donald Trump from the Human Rights Council, but that was a different story. For a country to be expelled, it's a major loss of face, and one expects that if the voting pattern that had been there earlier in the General Assembly of 140, 141 votes going against Russia, then the likelihood is that the 129 votes that are required to expel Russia from the Human Rights Council will be obtained by this resolution, and Russia will be ousted from the Human Rights Council. This will be also I think a blow for the Human Rights Council, because the Human Rights Council is a different kind of council from the Security Council. What is happening in Ukraine is an invasion where war crimes are being committed. There already is a human rights monitoring mission of the UN in Ukraine for the last 10-12 years, and they have been monitoring the human rights situation there. What has been seen from the withdrawal of the Russian forces in Bucha is that war crimes have been committed where civilians have been tied up and summarily executed by the army before it withdrew or while it was in occupation of territories like Bucha. And I suppose as the Russians withdraw from various parts of Ukraine, more such atrocities will come to light. But the Human Rights Council is a different kind of body. As I said, it's essentially a promotional body. It's a body where countries get together to try and discuss issues. It doesn't have any coercive powers like the Security Council does to punish a country. So the action would essentially be symbolic, but yes, it would be loss of face for Russia.
Interesting. Action will be symbolic, but definitely a loss of face for Russia is what you are going to see it as. Maruf, the point is, will this stop killings in Ukraine? Will this improve situation between Russia and Ukraine?
The short answer is no, because the Russians have set out and they have certain aims in mind. They have certainly run into a lot of roadblocks, both physically and in terms of usage of the term, because the Ukrainians have really stuck it out, and this has increased Russia's frustration. I would say some of those alleged human rights abuses are possible with armies running into a deadlock on the ground situation, because clearly the Russians had expected it all to get over in about 2 weeks. But there are other bigger issues. I think the issue is, firstly, it exposes the impotence of the UN as a body. Everyone seems to swear by it, but the UN cannot enforce its opinion on maintaining peace and security when a P5 member of the UN is involved and can continue to exercise a veto. The second is that there is a need connected with that for not just to marginalize Russia, but to actually look at a fresh approach to how the UN should function. It's an outdated organization with countries in the Security Council. Some of them have been passed, and countries like India, where the media is again and again bringing out today, it's a big test for India. It's a test for Russia. As far as we are concerned, our position on human rights has been very sound all along. In fact, if you go to the UN human rights body and their offices in Geneva, the only statue outside the building is of Mahatma Gandhi, not Abraham Lincoln, not Martin Luther King, or any other champion in the West of human rights. The world regards Gandhiji and his values as essential to human rights in our modern times. And India has to probably live up with it. And even if India casts a vote against Russia on this count, it doesn't undo India's stand, which has been a very considered stand and a foreign policy that India has adopted historically when Russia invaded Hungary or Czechoslovakia, or there were other instances. Let me also inform you and the audience that the West likes to play a holier-than-thou role and position itself as though it has done no wrong. If you look back at the atomic bombings of Japan, the napalm bombings of Vietnam, or in between the bombings of Germany, you will see that America is no saint in white clothes. And also the fact is that even how the bombings took place in Kosovo with US and NATO bombing the hell out of Kosovo for 78 days, when Russia, Mr. Putin and Mr. Lavrov actually at the front of it were pleading that go easy, give it a little time. But as you know, the West can do no wrong.
Right.
And only Russia does wrong. And finally, an important point, and that is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, notwithstanding everything else, is part of a bigger game that superpowers are playing there. Ukraine, unfortunately, has been dragged into it. And it's very sad. And India's stance has always been very considered, very mature. And I don't think we should be pushed into deciding who's the good guy or the bad guy. As somebody wrote in a column in an important weekly magazine, you don't have to make a choice between two sets of scoundrels.
Okay. Now, Mr. Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti, the question I want to ask you is Russia really then bothered about this loss of face that we are talking about? Will it actually put Russia on the back foot?
Well, I think it's part of the propaganda war that the West is conducting against Russia. And it will make no difference to Russia, to the war and the campaign on the ground. It will do what it has to do or what it's chosen to do in Ukraine. But it's part of that information war that has been conducted. But then, if it is true, if all these allegations of human rights violations, of civilian killings, etc., and it would seem that they are, because even India has condemned the civilian killings without naming anybody, because there have been, to be honest, there have been killings, these kind of violations on both sides. Even Ukraine, there are clips going around showing that Ukrainians are shooting prisoners of war, which is against the Geneva Convention. You can't do that. So I think both sides have committed human rights violation. But the question is, what will India do? Will India vote abstain again? Because so far we have abstained. But given the fact that we have, of course, not named any country, so the choice is between either abstaining or voting for the resolution to expel Russia. To expel Russia would obviously mean that it would be a major step for India in this scenario. So I think the choice they must be making is between abstention and voting for the resolution. So let's see what happens, but that choice will be made by the highest in the land. And so we'll have to wait and see how it goes.
Okay. Interesting point there. But Mr. Dilip Sinha, what should India do? Either it's going to be abstention or voting for the resolution. In your opinion, what should India be doing?
Well, I think we should condemn the killings because quite evidently killings have taken place. Our own correspondents are there. So to call it a Western propaganda, I think is disingenuous. There are at least half a dozen Indian correspondents there who are covering and reporting from there. There have been killings, those dead bodies and all those Russian tanks that were there. Whatever the crimes and whatever the geopolitics be, nothing justifies an invasion of another country. That is a violation of the UN Charter, and the International Court of Justice, where an Indian judge also sits, has declared to be illegal. So on that, there should not be any dispute or any discussion. I think in the Security Council, we should have voted to condemn Russia for the invasion. But on this Human Rights Council issue, as I mentioned, the Human Rights Council is a different kind of body. It's a cooperative body where there are various serial human rights violators. I don't need to name those countries, but they are members of that council. And the Human Rights Council is based on the principle that you encourage these countries to come to the Human Rights Council where they can sit and discuss issues, and then they are encouraged to improve their human rights record. So this is, it is not a coercive body like the Security Council. So I think expelling Russia from the Human Rights Council defeats the whole purpose of the Human Rights Council. And that is where I think that Russia should not be expelled from the Human Rights Council. It should be encouraged to sit and discuss human rights issues. What has happened in Ukraine falls more in the category of the Geneva Conventions of killings of civilians in a situation of war, which is different from human rights violations that take place inside a country because of state authority being misused. And those are the kinds of issues that the Human Rights Council discusses and tries to encourage various state authorities to accept best practices from different countries to see how law and order can be improved in a country while respecting human rights. And I think the Human Rights Council has served that purpose to a certain extent. It's not a flawless body, it's not an entirely successful body. So my difficulty here is that while I'm entirely in favor of condemning the aggression of Russia on Ukraine, on this particular resolution, I think it's a wrong resolution. But then, given the present situation where the world has got so polarized and India's interests clearly lie, while we may have our national interest to a certain extent with Russia, our larger interests lie with the West. And here we'll have to probably take a choice and either abstain. And I think we'll probably abstain because that's probably the best thing for us to do in this present situation.
Okay, Maruf, Russia has also warned countries of the United Nations that a yes vote or abstention on a US push to suspend Moscow will be viewed as an unfriendly gesture. So the two options that we've discussed so far, Mr. Sinha says India should abstain. Mr. Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti feels that either we should vote for or abstain. But if we choose either or these two, then there is a warning that Russia has given.
See, warnings are being issued left, right, and center by both the big powers and many others. I think we've grown up enough to worry about warnings. The second thing is that please understand, human rights has become a beating stick for the Western world after the end of the Cold War, when they suddenly painted themselves as holier than thou, that they had never done anything wrong. And countries which are developing or third world countries should be hauled over coals, India included. And this is where I have a problem with this whole, I would say pretentious approach to human rights, because human rights is a very, very large encompassing term, and it is used conveniently by whichever country when it wants to. I am not for a moment saying abuses have not taken place in Ukraine. All I'm saying is that you might recall during the second Gulf War, when America was not able to get even its Western friends like France and some others in the European world to support their initiative to have a resolution against Iraq to go in and bomb Iraq to high heavens like they did in the first Gulf War. So what they did was eventually go in with the coalition of the willing, as they called it. And they are probably applying a similar kind of a deflective narrative because they know that the same Security Council, which they exercise huge powers in, is not getting around to passing any resolution, because find me one resolution in the Security Council's entire history, Mr. Sinha might be able to educate us a bit more, which is against a country that's a permanent member of the Security Council. Only lesser mortals like us are burdened with resolutions passed at a time when our diplomats were hoodwinked by either Britain or somebody else. Now, the second aspect is what comes out of this resolution. Yeah, it will give the Americans and their cheerleaders a certain degree of comfort that, see, we've had Russia marginalized or blacklisted or whatever. But it doesn't address the core problem. The core problem is, how can you get a country that is a P5 member of the Security Council stop taking the law in its own hand? And this is what today Russia is doing.
Yes.
Tomorrow China could do. And this, I think, is the central dilemma for New Delhi.
Okay. Mr. Sinha, will you like to respond to what Maruf has raised?
Well, we have to keep in mind that the United Nations has very strong limitations, and Maruf Raza has absolutely pointed out some of these major limitations. But the fact is that we still want to become permanent members of the Security Council. We are very keen to remain members of the Human Rights Council. So we have to play within the limitations and, of course, keep pressing for reforms. Now, reforms are not going to take place. We have tried for the last 25, 30 years to reform the Security Council, but the permanent members themselves hold a veto on any kind of reform. So they, unfortunately, I think the reform of the Security Council can only take place when another war takes place. And I hope this war doesn't flare up into a world war. But that is the tragedy of the UN system. But within that system itself, certain amount of pressure, certain amount of peer pressure is built up on countries through resolutions, which to a certain extent countries do look up to and look at with a certain degree of apprehension and concern. And the Human Rights Council is one of those bodies where countries do pay a lot of attention to their image. And that is what the effort of the UN and the Human Rights Council certainly is. The Security Council is a different kind of body altogether, where there are different sets of power politics that plays out. So that is the position today. We have to, if we get into the game, we have to play it by the rules of the game, or else stay out of it.
Okay. Mr. Pinak Ranjan Chakraborty, I want to give you the last word. Can India really afford to stay out of it the way it managed to stay out at least 11 times since January?
Well, firstly, let me say that human rights as an international sort of an accepted norm is fine. But let's also recognize that human rights have been used as a diplomatic tool to apply pressure. And I have personally been part of that receiving end of that pressure from none other than the United States. But then human rights are waived or ignored when their own interests come into play. So this is the situation. This is the reality of global politics. The UN system, for example, is also reflects the reality that the great powers or the P5 members will not allow any resolution to be passed which is enforceable against them or against their allies. Hence, we have to deal with this situation. Though morality is sometimes thrown around, at every sort of country, but morality is not very deep. It is very skin deep in international politics. Now, the UN, I think your question was about, sorry, can you remind me?
It was about India. Can India really, afford to stay out of the game this time, the way it managed to at least 11 times since January?
I do believe India can exercise the right to abstain because the Human Rights Council, as my colleague Ambassador Sinha explained, it's not the same as the UN Security Council. So I think, as he said, it is inclusive. They want people to stay. And in fact, the surprising thing is about the Human Rights Council membership is that some of the worst violators of human rights are there in terms of members. And that is one of the reasons why the Trump administration had walked out of it. And then the Biden administration came back knowing that this was not a good move to stay out of that. So I think this is the situation at the moment. So I do believe that if we abstain, it won't matter too much, because if those who want to expel Russia will in any case vote for the resolution. And even if we abstain, it wouldn't matter too much.
Okay, so it should not really be seen as a test of India's neutrality, really, Maruf, then. Maruf, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Was that question for me? Sorry. India has made its position amply clear that we will not take sides on this issue. We have national interest, we have strategic interest, and though I know condoning Russia's aggression of Ukraine can set a precedent where China could do the same and people could ask us that what are you going to say now? But 2-3 quick points. Point one is that when China intruded into Ladakh, none of these champions of freedom or territorial integrity and what have you stood up and spoke for India. They were all silent, including the United States. Secondly, if India takes sides, it's being made out to be a really final one vote which could tip the balance, but it's not it. We are just another member of the General Assembly, which is really our vote counts as much as that of Seychelles and Fiji Islands. And therefore, I believe, whatever Mr. Dilip Sinha's assertions, I believe that we really should actually, this neutral stance should be the start point of our starting a debate in our country that should we pull out of the UN, because it's a defunct, toothless body. And finally, and most importantly, let me tell you that as far as the world is concerned, there will always be sides that will be taken. And taking no side is a policy decision also, as Prime Minister Narasimha Rao once explained.
Right. And we'll now see what really happens in the Assembly. I appreciate all of you, Maruf Raza, Pinakranjan Chakravarti and Dilip Sinha, for joining us here on Urban Debate on Mirror Now this evening. Good to have you all on the show today. With this, we will slip into another short break. Lots lined up for you on the other side as well. Stay with us.